Hello, and thank you so much for coming here tonight. I really am most comfortable hunched over a computer with bad posture as opposed to speaking, but I'm going to try and really appreciate it. I am going to talk about some work that I've done, but really not so much with the idea of it's all about moi, but more just like in whatever design work we do and look at, like things to think about and things people have taught me and that I've learned along the way. So I hope this advances. I've been doing this since shortly after the earth cooled, and I was really lucky to have a chance to work at Apple. I was a typical liberal arts art major, and I didn't really know anything about computers, but a high school friend of mine, Andy Hertzfeld, who was a system software programmer at Apple, told me he needed some graphic help. And since I was working in a store at the time, sounded great, because I wasn't really doing, it was a great store, but I wasn't really doing design work. And when I got to Apple, this advertising hadn't been written, but the prevailing thought was a group of programmers that thought there could be a bit of a more humanistic side to computing. So subsequently, I've done lots of icons for lots of different companies, but don't worry, we're not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to highlight a few. As I said, I had a little bit of graphics experience working at the Franklin Institute, which is a science museum in Philadelphia. And I worked there for a designer named Harry Laux, who's fantastic. And he had gone to Art Center and worked for Charles Eames. So that was kind of my awakening that graphic design was even a thing. But I was really good at this. And I learned how to use that phototypositor. I was sort of trying to gather my confidence to go for the interview at Apple. Like, yes, I do have typography experience because the job was described to me as making typefaces and some images for this computer. So I went to the library in Palo Alto where I lived at the time, and I just got all the type books I could and I actually took them with me to the interview so it would seem like I knew what I was doing. And they never asked me to open the books, but Andy also said, well, you know, if you just go get some graph paper and with the smallest squares that you can, and that's what the job will be like. And I had dabbled with an Apple II, but I hadn't really bonded with it. But, you know, I thought I could do this. So it's funny, though, because these were just things I made up with no assignment to take to my interview, thinking. And it actually maybe led a little groundwork toward things that, that we used in the Mac. So one thing I always like to say, we all have this oddball, maybe not everybody's oddball like me, but a set of skills that you don't necessarily think are qualifications for something, but I think you just need to have confidence in what you can do. And I was super excited that sketchbook, also don't let your mom throw away your stuff when you move out of the house, but is actually in the collections of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and New York MoMA now. So something that would have seemed unfathomable at the time. So I'm really grateful to them. When I got to Apple, this is what the screen of the Mac looked like. So my job was just like, hey, can you make this look better? And you know, it it was still kind of magical because you could take a mouse and drag these round rects around, and do it actually became okay because it sort of looked either like do it or dolt. So that got changed. And then, I always love to have a job where when you come in and you see the before, it looks really bad because it's much easier to make a good after. So, but the first thing, I really understood, it was a grid of black and white squares, and there were 32 squares to the inch. And the very first thing that I did there was the Chicago font, because they said they needed something bold to stand out to use in these windows. So I looked at the existing fonts, and they were all kind of jaggedy. It really didn't seem like rocket science to just make things on 45-degree angles and verticals and horizontals. So that's what I did. And yeah, the X will always be funky, but but most of them kind of worked out. And some of the other fonts that I designed when I got there were San Francisco, the real San Francisco. You could name it anything. I can't understand why you'd need to recycle that. But although someone said it would be better if it was Francisco Sans, like that would have been fun. And I made a monospace font, and I just looked at type books. Sorry, that M is a little funky in this picture. To make a kind of basic serif and sans serif. And Chicago had a pretty good lifespan as the system font, and it had a little Redux episode in the first iPod. So we didn't know we were designing the iPod at the time, but when we made the calculator. But so when we would talk about in the software group what we were trying to do, and I think a lot of this isn't, I wince at this because it should be, anybody can use it, but that's what I had in my notebook. The idea just being a naive user could use it, and like games, like it would be ideal not to have any manuals, and it should be friendly. So all those things really made sense to me because I was probably like in that batch where I even found the Apple II to be a little daunting. So these were some of the images of things that I designed when I first got to Apple. And I'm pretty positive that this was inspired by this. I was kind of obsessed with this button when I was about 14. I just thought it was so cool. And that's probably the derivation. There's a wonderful book about comics by Scott McCloud, who didn't set out to write a book about user interface, but I think it's a terrific book because it talks about communicating through images. And I wouldn't have thought to say this, but he explains that when you add more detail, it looks less like you. So whether that's a pen or a face, if you reduce it to its essential cartooniness, anyone can see themselves. And he explains it another way by saying the less detail, the more universal, and which sort of goes counter to some like emoji sensibility now, where it's like, oh, if we have 5 skin tones or 20 skin tones or 50, it'll be enough. And sometimes I think about it almost the opposite way, that it'll never be enough. So if you make things that are simple, you don't exclude anybody. I don't know what happened. Maybe I did that, sorry. So we made some things for the Mac that I was told would never be seen, and this was one of them. So, I kind of had fun with it. And this one, I was told really nobody would ever see this, because it would just be such a catastrophic failure. So, especially now looking back, I probably wouldn't pick that image, but it was meant to be sort of like a Roadrunner cartoon kind of thing. And, the sad thing is it got a little more exposure than was intended. And someone sent me this picture. It's a subway station in Sweden. So I think, oh, well, that's kind of fun, even though it looks a lot like something I designed for cards for MoMA. But I thought that made me really happy. When I first got to Apple, I was able to get off graph paper almost immediately because Andy Hertzfeld wrote this icon editor. And you can see at the top that's why they needed a system font, because they're just using something a little random. But it's so easy to forget with so many dozens of layers of undo and so many tools in Photoshop, which I love. But this seemed magical at the time, just that you could. You didn't have to use an eraser and graph paper. You could toggle these, you could toggle it and you could see it large and small at the same time. It just seemed so exciting. When I very first got there, I was taught how to figure out the hex by counting the order of the pixels, and then the hex representation became automatic, which was pretty great, but then it still had to get entered to see your thing on the screen. And I think these aren't crying, I just was counting. These are just like pieces of paper I had. And you can see one thing that I learned at Apple was very, very little was on paper. The programmers I worked with, I just thought were so amazing because they were so fearless about building something every day and trying things new and getting it up into the software so people could work with it and not just kind of look at it in a kind of a crit kind of a way. So that was, this wasn't very good, but it was something that I thought maybe could be interesting, but wasn't. Here's another like bad idea for the title bar, but I loved and still do like to do portraits in 32 by 32 because it's so amazing that for most people, even with that number of dots, you can make things that look like people. So I always preach lots of iteration. It's like editing is the really the gift of being able to develop things. And I started out thinking, okay, we had like 5 applications. We can have hands that are doing something as the verb, and then the document would be the piece of paper. It's like never really thinking that someday there would be thousands of applications. Maybe this wouldn't hold up, but at the time it seemed like a system that would help people understand. I mean, the same thing about fonts. We had 255 numbers for fonts, and maybe we used 10 of them because we just didn't ever think there would be more than 255 digital fonts. That just seemed like plenty. Like wrong. And I tried to make this so that it wouldn't have a gender or an age, so it crops the face. I know after I left Apple, they made some faces that were kind of squarish, and maybe interpreting this as the whole face, not a crop. I thought we could just get who uses hourglasses. We could like move to the future. This I just use as an example that I think I learned the hard way. It's usually not a good idea when you're making icons to make them look like any particular piece of technology because it will be obsolete before you know it. And I think this looks kind of like an image writer printer. It had a big knob on the side, and those dots are the sprockets, which most of you probably haven't ever seen. But I realized, like, if I had just made it simpler and pared it down and not been kind of reveling in like, oh, I can draw an image writer printer in 32 by 32, it probably would have had like a much longer lifespan, like just enough detail. And sometimes I think about like the street crossing signs where there's a silhouette of two kids holding hands, and there isn't really a technological limitation that they couldn't have 3D plaid lunch boxes and hair ribbons, and you could lard that with detail that might make it interesting, but at the end of the day, it would probably just make it harder to see it at a glance and understand what it was. This is what a Mac menu looked like in development, and the command symbol at first, the placeholder, was an apple. And one day, Steve Jobs came in and he was like, that is our logo. That's our crown jewel. You can't just throw that, you know, have an apple farm in every menu. So then we had to go back and think, like, what could, it was the command key or the feature key. Yes, I did try 10 Commandments. It was stupid and like puns, never international, not a good idea. But I used to look through books sometimes when I was at a loss for something, and I looked at it in this symbol dictionary, and there was that symbol, and it said feature, and we used to call it the feature key. So I kind of thought, well, you could definitely draw it in 16 by 16, and it kind of looked like a cloverleaf highway to me, so maybe it was like stretching to try to give it some meaning as opposed to be just abstract. And but it was a symbol for like interesting features. In the book I had, it said in Swedish campgrounds. Finally, I went to Sweden, like probably 5 or 6 years ago, and I was going to Gothenburg, and right outside of the airport was this sign, and it was so exciting to me. Like there was our feature key. But it's had a pretty good lifespan, and normally I would think, no, you really want every symbol you make to mean something. And somebody emailed me not that long ago, and must have heard me say that I wish that symbol meant more. And he sent me a picture or he said it actually, the derivation of that symbol in Scandinavia was that it's a castle with turrets. So that's why it's a good symbol for landmarks. And I just loved that it actually meant something after all. Even though I can't say that I thought of that. This was the first control panel for the original Macintosh, and the idea was trying to make it not have any words, so that one article described it as a crib toy, like which I don't think was supposed to be a compliment, but I didn't think it was a bad thing. We tried to use animation to give feedback, so that like the speeds of the key clicks and the cursor blink, it had a little life to it. Maybe not 100% extensible, but I liked the idea that it didn't need translating. And it was great working at Apple because I kind of had a corner on the market for Mac graphics. So I was able to do some of the packaging and marketing stuff. This woodcut came from like a really early scan that Bill Atkinson did in trying to develop a scanner, and he used a print that Steve had and brought in, and the face didn't really come out because the scanner wasn't too precise, but the flowers are pretty much untouched. So that's where that came from. Made these tools I worked a lot with Bill. He's a genius. And cared so much about every detail. So we were really trying to make things seem, if you didn't understand computers, you could get an idea of what the feature would be. And I feel good that, like, this isn't the absolute latest, but a lot of these images are high res, but they're the same kinds of symbols. Sometimes I think people forget that if you study art history, there is nothing new under the sun, and people have been communicating with little images and using symbols, you know, before the 20th century, and making letter forms out of bits, actual bits, and telling stories with pictures. I love this animal. I didn't do it. And I love all kinds of folk art that I definitely know that I was inspired by a lot of the projects I did growing up. My mother had polio when she was pregnant with me, so she couldn't walk super well. So we did a lot of crafts and sewing, and I still think that some of the typefaces are just amazing, and definitely predated the Macintosh. Probably was my first digital project when it was cool to have your kids make ashtrays. Too bad all that creativity is suffering now. But I always think it's not, I got started with pixels, and I wanted to just do a quick example. Even though this is pixels, it's probably the same process for other kinds of design work. This was for Swatch, and the idea was a 20 by 20 image for a digital watch that would mean alarm. So I started with, you know, a clock and made it noisy, and then maybe more noisy, or maybe you really want to make it look kind of literally like an alarm clock, and a noisy alarm clock. Then I kind of started over. Maybe it could be simpler, but same kind of idea. Or maybe you see this and you think alarm because it's a travel alarm clock. Make it a little different. And then it's like maybe all of that was just too self-referential. Like, why would you want a clock on a clock? It's like, it's always weird to see those phone icons on a phone that doesn't look like that. But, so, you know, what are things, you know, I really like animals and animal forms, so I always throw that in. But I thought this made sense. Or the alpha alarm clock. But the idea being, and a bell, which I think they ultimately did use a bell, and somehow bells now mean notifications in many apps, something I don't understand because there's a bell in every elevator, and it's like, I have a problem. I'm gonna touch that bell, or wake up, or go to school, not like a fun thing. But anyway, the idea is it's not an exact science. I think it's always good to make a range of things. I would always show clients ranges of things, and if they said they wanted something specific, I would try and do exactly what was asked for, but also try to expand, throw in some other ideas too. After I worked at Apple, I worked for Microsoft, and it was like, whoa, so exciting to have color, even to differentiate things and use as a tool. It was almost like another dimension, even though so many of these colors were bad. And but I was able to, one of my favorite projects was working on these solitaire cards, and it was great because all the colors that you really needed were there, and you didn't have to have fuchsia. And I had to take solitaire off every computer I had, because otherwise I would just keep playing. And I feel very proud of this. because what were, you know, there were those apps that like hid the game when your boss walked by. I think that was really prompted by too much solitaire. Areaware, that's a company in Brooklyn, a few years ago, asked if they could make a real deck, which I thought was just kind of fun, but we did do the cutout at the corner as a pixel memory. This was something I did for Windows that didn't ship, but it was a background pattern, because a lot of the background patterns that shipped were things like Day-Glo chessboards. And I thought there's a way to just use those colors. If you dithered them carefully, you could make something that didn't look so garish. And I feel good that even though it was before texting, when the Mac shipped, we had a font with images so that you could combine images with your text for emphasis or for fun. And there was one that didn't ship for very long called Taliesin that I think was inspired by all the rub-down sheets. If you were an architect in the olden days and you wanted to do mock-ups, sometimes you needed transfer art for that. And I always tried to hide a character in fonts, just that there would be some weird key sequence that to get a little surprise. I didn't work on click art, but it was an early Mac app, and it had just tons of images. It was very popular with church bulletins. I worked on a product now in product graveyard called the Magic Link, which Sony and Motorola produced and Apple collaborated with. And it was pre-phones, but it was a portable thing that you could, the idea was postcards could drop out of the sky you could send one from your device, and someone with another device could get this postcard, which basically is just like any email. But it seemed really kind of magical at the time, so we made a lot of rubber stamps that you could drag onto your postcards to decorate them. So I like to think there were these other companies who were a little bit ahead of the curve on that illustration can be so delightful when you combine it with text. So I keep doing the same project over and over and over and over. That's the theme here, just like life. I worked for Facebook on this virtual gift project when you couldn't, it was very difficult. I don't even think you could upload any of your own images and photos. So these cost $1. It started out to be a charitable project. But then I did this for almost 4 years, and every day at midnight we'd release a new image, and for $1. And I mean, I sometimes think if my kids came to me and said, "Can I have your credit card so I can send someone a digital cupcake?" It's like, I wouldn't have done it. But it was kind of fun because it was like, what can you draw in 64 by 64 pixels that will make people actually spend $1? And I thought that was a wonderful challenge, and I think I learned a lot because we had some limited editions, but I tried all kinds of different things. And, love is always good. Sometimes I tried to make things that I just thought were more artful, and I have to say those did not usually sell very well. The things that really sold well, a lesson for us all, is people just like bears and penguins. And we probably had 5 different hundreds of thousands of limited edition penguins. And so I have said this before, but I always think if my life depended on drawing something that I could get money for, I would draw a penguin, because that was our, and even though this was the all-time bestseller. And people bought these. And ultimately, Facebook stopped doing it because they wanted third parties to be able to benefit from this. And it was so interesting because after about the third year of each holiday, you would, cranberry sauce from a can, what that's shaped like. You would try and do different things that were that would seem fresh. So I worked on some stickers for a company called Path because they wanted a little bit of a retro look. But whether it's vector or pixel, this is pretty much my process, which I think is pretty general. Like, always get all the info and constraints up front, because every job has constraints. Sometimes people say, like, why was it even fun to work on black and white in a really big grid? And I think, well, everything has either money constraints or production costs or how big it is. And as long as you understand that, then you can be creative within it. And as I said before, always, there's not just one solution, unless you're Paul Rand, who's like, here it is. And then I usually like narrow the options and just keep iterating till everyone's happy. This was just an example of a logo curbside, which enabled you to drive up to places and they would have your stuff ready. So I kind of thought, well, it's about driving and cars and signage, and like that might be a nice way to do it. And so I made those things and mocked it all up, and that they ended up wanting a shopping bag that was flying through the air. So one good thing about contract work instead of working for a company is you just pour your heart into it and give them the solutions that we've worked on together, and then whatever they do, that's fine. Working at a company, you have more of a long-term, like, I feel like it keeps me up at night more. And I work at Pinterest. I've worked there almost 5 years, and it is the home of inspiration, which I feel really proud of, kind of a happy, inspiring place in what can be a cold internet. And I've done all kinds of different projects. I started on icons when I got there, and maybe like trying to develop from those icons a design language that could work in different ways. And these were not implemented, but I worked with an animator who I just thought was so amazing because it's so minimal. Like, I think not every icon has to scream at you and be bouncy to enhance its meaning. I worked on a cafe, love to make stickers. I love to do annual cards for Pinterest, and I just love the push pin because it's in the name and it's such a good metaphor for I care about something. So all kinds of projects and goods. And I've been making different pins on different themes in our different offices. So 4 big takeaways: have confidence in your skill mix. Don't fear constraints, because it often is the spark you need to be creative. Iteration is great. And I think this is true. It's like the more you try to make something that's never been made before, you haven't ever been to Letterform Archive, because it's all there. And I was very happy to come tonight because I love Letterform Archive. I think it's like an underutilized like treasure trove, if I saw there were a lot of hands of people that hadn't been there, of all kinds of graphic materials, some that are familiar and some, at least to me, never even knew existed, and it's all, there's something so inspiring about seeing it in life, and also more and more there are beautiful digital reproductions, imagery online, so that you don't have to visit in person, although it's pretty great. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. That was beautifully inspirational. I'm wondering if you might be able to share a story of failure and what you learned from it.
That's a really good question. And I think I don't even know the answer to that question, how to answer it really well. I've certainly experienced trying really hard to please a client and come up with something, and then they just maybe don't use it. I had one client where I had done logos, and I showed the logos with my business partners, and the CEO said, "Oh my gosh, we love them all. We don't even know which one we're going to choose." That was a Thursday. On Monday, he called me and said, "You know, we've been thinking about it, and we're not sure any of these are a future classic." And I thought, well, how about your product? Is that a future classic? But you know, and it hurt only because I always try really hard to really solve the problem, not at all opposed to feedback and doing it over. But I think in this particular case, I just felt like I was so elated because they saw what I had put in, and then, so I think I try, I'm always told, like, don't take it so personally, because my family could tell you, you know, when you're disappointed and you're me, I feel so terrible that I failed, and I should have the ability to make everybody happy. But I know that what you get told is just like move on, and that's probably a good thing, especially as when decision making is distributed, I think, and there are many levels of decision makers, it's often hard to, like, I love it when there's like one, either a small group of people or someone that you can really talk to and explain. I think that helps, but.
Okay, here we go. Let's do that one, and then you.
How do you think about constraints when there are no constraints? Because when you're designing that stuff, you were limited by the tech, but now you can draw anything on screen, so I'm curious.
I think I usually think of it as like the difference between graphic design and your own artwork. Like when you make art, there are no constraints. Like you can just do, you make up the problem and you solve it. But usually I think working as a graphic designer, someone comes to you with, whether it's a logo or it's, you know, there's some constraints. Definitely, oh, now there's a million colors. But, and I always think just because you can use a million colors, you don't need to use them all in every project. But it's both freeing and terrifying. I mean, there's something kind of reassuring in knowing there's a finite number of solutions when it's a grid. But I think you just have to be more disciplined with yourself and thinking about what path, and that you can't do everything in every job.
It would be great if you could share a little bit more about inclusive design and accessibility in the work that you've done?
I wish Kat Holmes were here. Do you know her book? I think I think that's so important, and it's so important to just remember that the user can be anybody. I'm definitely not a trained expert in that field. I would say my instinct is always, as I said even a long time ago, don't make a hairstyle, and don't put in details that exclude people. I think it just is really, I suppose my approach is more just like, think about what you can do in making images that more people can relate to as opposed to fewer. Just even if it's, you know, like illustration is a different story, but in symbols, it's good to use silhouettes and no gender details if it's possible.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for sharing everything. That was super cool. You talked about the phone icon that doesn't look like a phone, and same thing with cameras. Now our cameras are phones. Do you have any thoughts on why that problem hasn't been solved, or any ideas on how that might be solved?
Well, I see, it's a good question, and it's like, why are there so many light bulbs for ideas? You know, I guess that's an Edison reference, and, you know, there've been some good ideas since that invention, but but some things that are abstract nouns and verbs are really hard, and I think that the phone thing, at first, I mean, I used to draw a phone. Okay, phones we're not using those receivers anymore. They're rectangles with a little antenna, or a big heavy rectangle with an antenna. But then all of a sudden, there's remote controls and iPods and things that look so similar, so it's a tough one. I think I used to use things like Rolodexes, and there's some things that are just in the graveyard that you can't use because younger people haven't even ever seen a Rolodex. But you know, that obviously the phone persists because there's not an obvious single piece to replace it. You know, some of the things that are obsolete, always trying to think of something good, like undo. You know, is it pulling out a nail? Sometimes it's just so hard to think of the perfect thing for abstract, but I'm sure there's something better than a phone, but maybe we just haven't found it.
Okay, right there, easy.
Thank you. And thank you, Susan. In the early days, well, going off of one of the previous topics about constraints, like there were low resolution displays and you had to design around that. And now we have very high pixel dense displays. We had to introduce a lot of constructs that people didn't understand, but now we have user experience and graphic design as a field. So I was wondering how you feel that the nature of the challenge for designers has changed over time, and a little more personally, as an engineer at Apple, how would you grade the work that we've been doing today?
I wouldn't. I wouldn't, but I mean, I'm a big user of Apple products. I guess I think that sometimes when you have super high resolution, I kind of touched on this before, the tendency to add detail just because you can, like, happens. Shadows and 3D and a little like Scott McCloud, you know, there's Prince Valiant instead of a smiley face. But at the same time, I mean, what I love about the screen density is that things like a subtle shadow and different ways of highlighting instead of just inverting are, there's just so many wonderful avenues you can take. I just think you have to exercise restraint. Like sometimes I think things get so complicated. There's 25 things on the screen, you know, begging for attention. And sometimes you have to resist that just because you can. But, you know, I would never, it's a tough question.
Okay. Hi, Susan. Could
Hi.
you talk a little bit more about how studying art history influenced your design career?
I would say it, even as much as, it's not so much that I would open an art history book and think, oh, I want to look at Bosch because I want to draw a weird monkey for this icon. It's that feeling of, I think inspiration is everywhere, and art history just is so rife with solutions, graphic solutions and design solutions and ideas and imagery that stood the test of time. And that's why I love looking at folk art and textiles. Obviously textiles are pretty good analog for digital stuff, but sometimes I think to overgeneralize, people at tech companies who are designing tend to look at images from other tech companies. It's like, oh, we're going to do reactions, so let's make our wow face have a bigger mouth. And I kind of think, like, why not spread the net a little wider? Like, there's just hobo signs and engravings and all that source material that maybe just can spur you to think a little bit more outside the valley.
Okay.
Thanks. So this is a simple one, I think. If you could add an emoji to the current Unicode emoji set, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know that I know right this second what I have searched for and haven't found. I mean, I tend to type a lot. I really like keyboard, like a colon and a lowercase n and a paren for a happy face. Like, I probably use that almost more than anything because it's really simple. But I would say the things I tend to use are I like the heart from the suit of cards because it's a little cleaner to me. And, you know, I have an Australian Shepherd, so I suppose the super trite answer would just be, where's my dog?
Thanks so much. Obviously, with the launch of Mac Paint, it was envisioned that everybody could tap into their artists. And I wonder, 30 years in, 35 years in, how do you feel the project's going?
Oh, tapping into your inner artist? I think I think about it a lot because at the time, it's like, does having a word processor make you a better writer? Well, yes and no. It doesn't really help you with ideas, but it makes the editing so much easier. And I guess I think about, like, there's not a day I don't have a mouse in my hand drawing and looking and sketching. I still like to sketch in books, but just that ability to combine text and images and moving vectors is so pleasant and iterative that that's better. But in terms of, does it give you ideas? Does it make you a better creator? it's a wonderful tool, but there are other wonderful tools too. And they're, you know, on one level, getting so much better with, you want to make an image that looks like a woven patch. You know, there's probably an app for it, but the things that you're able to do pretty easily, that it's possible to show your ideas, I feel like that's pretty magical, and that's better than it used to be. But I don't feel as if it's the be-all and end-all, that it's qualitatively better than someone who has a nice soft pencil on a pad.
So I was just curious if you have made any more fonts since, I assume you have, but what fonts have you made since working on the digital ones?
And I do tiny little fonts. Oh, sorry. I still love to make fonts. I don't make vector fonts, but I do a fair amount of, for personal use, tiny little fonts and things that are inspired by some graphic ephemera. But it's not my bread and butter.
Tiny little fonts like Diamond, Excelsior, what? Okay, any more questions? We're all good. Okay, I thank you again, Susan.